There was a recent study that got a lot of headlines and gave some really bad news to people who practice intermittent fasting. This article from the American Heart Association found that an 8-hour time-restricted eating window, which is basically that 16-8 fast that so many people do, will increase your risk from dying from heart disease by 91%. What's worse is if you already have heart disease or cancer, then that increases your risk of dying even more. They also found that if you restrict your food to within this 8-hour eating window, that it doesn't increase lifespan compared to normal eating windows. Now, first off, before I go any further, this isn't a real study yet. It's actually an abstract from the American Heart Association conference, so it still has to go through a whole peer review process and it has to get published. So we're still waiting on the full study. But that didn't stop all these headlines and news articles popping up and saying that you should stop your intermittent fasting because it's gonna kill you. So should you be worried? Well, let's look a little bit closer at the data. So how do they even collect data in this study in the first place? So they collected data from over 20,000 people from NHANES, or the National Health and Nutrition Examination Surveys. And they collected this data from about 2003 to 2018. So in other words, it's this big data of questionnaires. They basically had people fill out these surveys and they had them fill out their timings of their meals. And over the course of those 15 years, they were basically checking to see the reasons that these people died. Now, I'm sure all of you know this, but surveys and questionnaires are very unreliable. They're actually one of the most unreliable ways of collecting data because of a couple things. Well, first of all, people might just forget. I mean, I have a hard time remembering what I ate yesterday. So how am I supposed to fill out a survey and fill out exactly what time I had all my meals? Or people might just say the wrong thing. They might be biased about something, or they might not want to even write on a piece of paper what times they actually ate. There could be a lot of flaws with this. And also, this study didn't really seem to include the other ways that people could have died. Now, it does help that there was over 20,000 participants. So don't get me wrong, that is a pretty good number to have for a study. But that number still could be inaccurate, because intermittent fasting didn't really get popular until like 2010. So if this data started getting collected at around 2003, the people that were practicing this eating window before it got popular could just be eating a bunch of calories in a smaller eating window. So if this study didn't really take calories into account, then we can't really say much from it. Because the main point of people doing that 16-8 fast is to cut calories. But if someone's eating 4,000 calories in an 8-hour eating window versus someone else eating 2,000 calories over a 16-hour eating window, then obviously the person eating the 2,000 calories is probably going to be healthier than the other person. Now again, we don't have this full particular study, but we do have some other studies. So this study was comparing people who eat normally throughout the day versus people who practice fasting and only eat within an 8-hour window throughout the day. They had a sample size of 2,050 participants, all aged between 18 and 65. So one of the first things they found is people who have their largest meal earlier on in the day tend to have lower BMI values. Now that point seems to be a little bit more legit, because people who have bigger meals earlier in the day versus people who have bigger meals later in the day, the people who have their meals earlier tend to be a little bit healthier. And the reason is you are more insulin sensitive in the morning. Meaning if you have a big meal early in the day, then your body's gonna be more likely to be able to turn that sugar into a source of energy. Versus if you have that bigger meal later in the day, then it's gonna be a little bit harder for your body, and you might end up turning more of that sugar into fat. Now, the other main finding of the study was people who confined their eating window to that 8-hour window had a higher BMI than those that had a normal eating window. So does that mean that people who do intermittent fasting have higher BMIs? Well, no. Again, this was a more correlational study. Now, the reason why this could be the case in this study could be something called reverse causality. It could be that people who have a higher BMI and have heart problems tend to have worse eating habits, and they could just be having all their calories in a smaller eating window. Those people aren't necessarily trying to practice intermittent fasting. They could also be eating worse foods in that eating window, or eating more calories in that smaller eating window. Both of those things are going to make them more unhealthy. So in my opinion, it doesn't seem like it's the timing of the meals that's the problem, but more so the actual foods that they're eating and the quantity, the amount of food that they're eating. Now, me personally, I don't think fasting is all that great. I think it's another form of calorie restriction at best. And if you look at the evidence, you'll see that actually cutting calories every single meal does better than people who practice intermittent fasting. But if fasting works for you and you like doing it, then I don't really see a problem with it. And I definitely do not think it causes heart disease. Now let's look at this other study. So this was a systematic review of randomized control trials, which, by the way, is a lot higher evidence than those observational or survey studies. In this study, they found that fasting helps improve triglyceride levels, cholesterol levels, and lowers your risk of heart disease. Now, if you wanted to base your data off of anything, it should be off of actual human control trials. Because this is exactly what's happening in human bodies in real time, and it's excluding other variables. It's not just a questionnaire where people had to fill out and they had to take a guess or sometimes forget about what they ate the other day or how much they ate or what time they ate. Now, also, this original abstract from the American Heart Association was specifically looking at those 16-8 fasts. Now, if you're gonna practice fasting, I really don't think that's the best way to practice in the first place. I think you're much better off doing a more alternate day fast, where one day you're eating like normal, then the next day you're only drinking water. If you look at that 16-8 fast that became so popular, it really became popular after studies on mice. So originally they found that mice who were fed specifically in an 8-hour eating window were much healthier than mice who ate throughout the day. The problem with this is mice only live about 2 to 3 years, and a mouse will die after only about 48 hours with no food. Humans, on the other hand, can survive a whole month without food. So for this study to be relatable to humans, that really equates to a multiple day fast for humans rather than a 16-8 fast. Now let's look at another study on that specific 16-8 fast on humans. So this 2020 study had 116 volunteers doing a 16-8 fast, and they found no weight loss or metabolic benefits on the people that did this type of fasting. And other studies on this specific type of fasting have found similar results. So my point here is, other than simply cutting calories, there's really no other benefits that you get from that 16-8 fast. But at the same time, if you do it and it works for you and it makes you happy, it's not gonna increase your likelihood of getting heart disease, and it doesn't seem like it's gonna really harm you in any way, as long as you're not eating too many calories in that smaller eating window. So in a nutshell, if you like to practice intermittent fasting and you can be successful with it, keep doing it. If, on the other hand, it's easier for you to do a calorie restriction every single meal rather than forcing yourself to only eat within this confined eating window, then you don't have to do intermittent fasting. You can keep eating like a normal person, just have smaller portions every single meal, and you'll probably be better off doing that. Also, a pro tip, if you are intermittent fasting, try to focus it so your bigger meals are earlier in the day. Like we talked about, you're more insulin sensitive earlier in the day, so it's better to have your bigger meals earlier. There's so many videos on the internet about how to remove these tonsil stones, but not many people talk about what causes them and how to prevent even getting them. So what even are tonsil stones? So tonsil stones are those like whitish gray little deposits that form on people's tonsils. And they're usually made up of a combination of like bacteria, food particles,